Is it okay to preach from notes on Sunday morning?
Sure.
Okay, I should have asked the question, why is it okay to preach from notes on Sunday morning?
The goal of the sermon is to be good, for it to connect with people and exalt Christ. And I don't really mean, if it does that, who cares if you have notes?
So the goal really shouldn't be like, I want to get to a point where I preach without notes.
I mean, there might be reasons why someone would think that would be a helpful tool in aiding their development. I think it actually could be. But no, who cares? I don't know. Is that in First Thessalonians? What verse is that in? Thou shalt not preach with no notes. So who cares?
All right, we'll talk about it. Hey, welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. My name is Dave. This is Luke Simmons. What's up, man?
Hey, buddy.
How you doing?
I'm great, especially with an intro like that.
I know.
What energy.
Podcasting 101. If you're interviewing someone, never ask a yes or no question, because you really want to hear what they have to say about it.
Is that right?
Actually, maybe it is. It is now.
Okay.
I've said it. Welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. This is the conversation that we have every single episode about how to communicate the gospel, how to communicate the good news, the electrifying presence of Jesus in 21st century America. The culture is always shifting. Culture is always changing. And the way people are processing and thinking is shifting with it, which means the way we serve up the scripture, we're not changing the scripture and we're not changing what the scripture means, but we are looking for ways to inject scripture into what is actually happening in real life so that it has a compelling narrative, so we communicate the compelling narrative in a way that it truly is. And that's what we do here on the Preaching Through podcast. Season 1 was all about the basics, the mechanics of preaching. This season is all about the nuances and the special case scenarios that you may find yourself in, except for this episode. This episode, we're going to go back to the mechanics, and we're going to talk about something that we didn't discuss in season 1, and that is preaching through your notes, your sermon notes.
Man, I mean, there's such strong opinions about this. Earlier this year, I put out a tweet. It's been around for a long time. Years ago, the late Tim Keller had posted a picture of one of his sermon notes, and it's like, I mean, it's just crazy. He had developed this almost like shorthand, right? And he was a Lord of the Rings fan, so we were all like, is that Elvish? But it was wild. I mean, and then he scribbled all over it, and you're going like, you might as well just hand me a sheet of hieroglyphics and say, go preach off of this. But yeah, like it's fun. And even then, like in our preaching lab, one of the things I do is go, hey, if you have sermon notes, like I'd love to just see it. Let's see how you organize it, see how it looks. And there are as many different approaches as there are preachers. So yeah, this is something fun to talk about.
One of the things that I like when we talk about things like this is it's not prescriptive, meaning you have to do it this way. It's descriptive. One of the areas that I really would have benefited during my days of full-time vocational ministry, I didn't preach a lot, but I taught enough from the platform that it really would have been helpful to have more visible modeling intentionally put in front of me. Not just, what's this preacher? How do they preach? What's their cadence like? Or are they using notes? Okay, they're not using notes, so I shouldn't use notes. But really saying, Dave, you don't have to do it this way, but let me just show you how I organize it. And maybe that'll spark something in your brain to get you thinking, maybe this would serve me as well.
Yeah, a leader that I admired at one point said, my job's not to fill your cup, it's to empty mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of what we're trying to do. I can't fill your cup on preaching, but I can empty mine. And so, yeah, we'll talk about notes. We'll talk about all sorts of stuff. And today it's notes or no notes or lots of notes or every kind of note. I mean, yeah, so fun conversation.
That's the question. What are the different approaches out there right now to notes that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, the three big category, I guess there'd be maybe 4 big categories. There's the full manuscript, someone that writes out every word for word. And then there's like a longer outline. That's probably more like what I would use.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually 2 to 3 pages of bullet point notes. There's like really short outline, like, that's a 3x5 or a Post-it note, like stuck in your Bible with a couple things on there. And then there's like nothing, just pure straight from your head, no notes. And so those are the main things I see. I mean, I'm sure there's different variations of that. Maybe sometimes they'll have slides and they'll use the slides as a way to key off of those, where it's like almost like the slides become like their notes. Mm. So yeah, those are the things I see. And I think there are some people who this maybe, I don't know where we want to go exactly with this, but like, I know some people who they manuscript their whole sermon, but that's not what they take up with them on Sunday when they're preaching. So I think that's really more what we're talking about, is like, what do you have in front of you when you go up there to preach?
That's the way I did it. In my very limited experience, I would be in my office. I would manuscript everything that I would want to say. And I was so inexperienced and so desperate to not look inexperienced that I wound up doing something which was pretty smart in hindsight. I would manuscript out the basics of what I wanted to say, and then I would just stand up in my office and I'd just start going through it. And then I'd find myself reaching a point where I didn't quite resonate with what I was trying to say, or I kept repeating the same word over and over. And so I'd go back to my manuscript, I'd change it out, and then I'd start the whole thing over again. And so I'd probably preach that message, I don't know, 6 or 7 times. It was like 2.5 hours of prep. But by the end of it, I had the words that I wanted, and I was able to go up with just a bullet list of the things that I had manuscripted out, but had rehearsed coming out of my mouth. So
when I've preached from all 4 kinds,
okay,
I've preached from a manuscript, the longer bullet points, the short little post-it note, and nothing. I've done all 4. And I have what I do normally now. So, I mean, as you can hear, like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Like, just be effective. If it's boring, it's not good. If it's sloppy because you can't remember what you wanted to say, well, that's not good. If it's really disengaging because it feels like you're just up there reading to us, like, well, that's probably not very good. But as long as you avoid those big problems, I think, like, hey, whatever.
All right, let's talk about it.
Your first 200 sermons are going to be terrible. This is something the late Tim Keller once said, meaning that no matter how hard you study, how many hours you put in, or how much you work on your preaching, there's this glass ceiling that can only be broken with more reps. So, getting reps becomes your main way of growing as a preacher. But what happens when you surpass 200 sermons? What are you supposed to work on? Where should you try and grow, or what muscles are you going to need to build to have a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry over the long haul? Well, the Preaching Lab is a curriculum developed by our co-host, Luke Simmons, that fills this gap and takes preachers beyond what they've learned in seminary or Bible college. This live experience provides preachers with meaningful feedback, insight, and instruction so that they can improve their preaching for a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry. During this 12-week preaching cohort, preachers learn of minor adjustments to their sermon habits that have a major impact on the preaching moment. Tweaks that nobody in your congregation has the ability or the confidence to give you. It's a deep inspection of your routines, habits, study, and preaching, all so that you can become a better steward of the gift God has given you every single week, an audience. This is your opportunity to return the favor back to your congregation and preach a sermon that is faithful and fruitful. Visit faithfulandfruitful.com/lab to learn more about the Preaching Lab live cohort, as well as the Preaching Lab on-demand video curriculum. Now back to the podcast.
So to frame up this conversation, we're going to talk about preparing, marking up, preaching, and then archiving.
Yeah.
That's the direction that we're going to go. That's the road we're traveling. So starting right off the bat, preparing notes, what should that look like?
This is where you do have to trial and error, figure out what works for you. And there are definite strengths of different approaches, right? So the real strength of the manuscript approach is you can be very specific, really thoughtful. You can think through all the transitions. You can think through specific wording. The pastor that preached at the church that I went to when I was in college, man, unbelievable Bible teacher. And that guy would pack so much in. He would preach sometimes a 23, 24-minute sermon. Not always. Usually it was around a half hour. But he would say more in 23 minutes than I've probably ever said in a 40-minute sermon.
Mm-hmm.
And he manuscripted. And he was very specific about his wording. And so there's a real strength to that. And he was able to do it in a way that, even though he, I think, actually was reading it, it never felt like it. On the other hand, the strength of fewer notes is it can come across as a little more natural. I mean, it is weird anytime a preacher is like, here's something to never forget. And then they look down at their notes. It's like, there is, I think sometimes in our culture, if someone isn't using notes, it can feel more credible.
Mm-hmm.
It can feel like they've really bought into this, so there can be some value to that, but you generally get a little sloppier on language, and you can actually get wordier and longer and repeat yourself more and make the point and then make the point and then make the point. And so there's different advantages to all of those different things. And as I said, I started out actually manuscripting. That was how I had to do it in the preaching classes I took. And I think that's a wise move for beginning preachers. I think for the reason you just mentioned in your story, you need to figure out how to organize your thoughts, and getting it actually written down, being able to run through it multiple times. That's a really valuable process. I actually did that even in the early days of our church plant. And then I realized this is just an extra like 2.5 hour assignment to write this that I don't have in the week when I'm trying to develop leaders and prepare all the other things that are going on in the church. So at that point, I moved into more of the bullet point thing. But the only reason I think I was able to do that is because years before, when I was helping out in a college ministry, at one point I made myself do a sermon with no notes at all. So is that how you did it? After you would, it sounds almost, Dave, like you would, write it all out and almost memorize it. Was I getting that right?
So in the first few times, no, but towards the end, I would have it largely memorized. And then today I do a lot of teaching as it relates to marketing. And what I will do is I will manuscript out what I want to say, and then I will memorize it. But that is very unique because it is a mastering of the material.
Yeah.
And so the only reason I was able to ever get to a point where I have it memorized was because I mastered the material. It was inside of me. And it's really hard to do that on a week-to-week basis. You see all these great keynote speakers, they've got 2 talks that they deliver maybe through the course of a 14-month span. So they can internalize it. They have that time, they have that luxury, and they kind of need to. But when you're preaching week to week to week, it's hard to master that particular material.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually what I want to actually encourage preachers to try to do.
Okay.
Is not to memorize it. Sometimes if someone hasn't memorized, especially it's one thing if you're talking about a relatively short video. If you're talking about a 30-minute talk,
completely different.
It's like you can see the person searching for the thing that they've memorized. Like it's actually disengaging.
Yeah.
Because they feel lost in their own head. You can see them up there. And so to me, the key is not memorizing it. It is internalizing it.
Yeah.
That's why I think at some point, every preacher at some point should preach at least one sermon with no notes, is because it forces you to do that. And you want to get to the point where if someone asks you, hey, what are you preaching about? And they ask you over coffee, you could say, well, here you go.
Yeah.
At least you want to get to the point that this is where I wanted to get to, where I could read a sentence on a page and that would trigger a whole sequence of thought that I'd go, okay, I know what I'm talking about there. And then here's a little line that tells me story about jumping over the baselines. I go, okay, I know what that is.
Yeah.
And it just, and so it's like, it's in there. It's deep in, like, and it does require practice, and it does require some rehearsal, and it requires wrestling with it. But that's where you have to get to. So that would be my argument. Whatever kind of notes you use, who cares? You've got to internalize the message so that it comes from a place that really feels authentic.
It's valuable to then have a sermon calendar, because with a sermon calendar, you know where you're going in the future. Go back to season 1. I think it's episode 6, preaching through a sermon calendar. On top of that, it's valuable to have a defined preparation system, a preparation process to dig the well over months, because you do not have an opportunity to master the material if you are trying to decide what to preach on on a Thursday night, and you've got to deliver it or a Thursday, and you've got to deliver it Sunday morning. You don't have the luxury of mastering the material. You just got to put together a coherent thought.
And like for me, I mean, I get to preach 3 times on a Sunday, right? So by the last service, I barely need the notes.
Right.
The challenge is, if I'm not careful, I can use that first service as a practice. And I just don't think you should practice on people. Like, I think it's worth running through a couple of times if necessary, in order to make it where that first time is really good. And hopefully the last time's really good too. But the reason that second, third sermon is, even though you're more tired, the reason it's kind of easier most of the time is because you have it more mastered.
So I'm curious, what percentage of the weeks do you wind up choosing the third service for the podcast?
I don't know.
Half?
No, I think less than half.
Really?
Yeah.
So out of the 3 services, there's 9 a.m., 10:45, and 4.
Yeah.
Which one do you think
I'd say most often I probably do the second service.
That's the one I attend.
But what I have found over the years is, especially if the sermon is coming from a uniquely deep place, that it really, if there's more inherent emotion for me, if I've connected with it, deeper, the first one is usually the best. And then the next ones, it's like, oh, it was so good. And I'm trying to recapture what it was, And so, sometimes, but I just, anyway.
So you've got the preparation of your notes. Then it goes into the marking up of your notes. And I realize this will be different depending on, are you using bullet points? Are you using a manuscript?
Yeah.
Are you trying to memorize it? So is there this in between marking up your notes? That's going to look different from person to person, but by and large.
Yeah. And for me, what I'm trying to do, and again, this is not prescriptive. What I'm trying to do is Thursday afternoon when I go home, I want my notes done. Like I could preach it Thursday night if I had to. They're there. I could look at them. I actually, and this is real specific, but sometimes guys like this specificity of stuff. I've switched over to storing the notes on Google Drive. And the reason for that is, even though I don't generally look at my notes between Thursday and Sunday, like I don't look at it on Saturday. I know a lot of guys will do that. I really want the mental break. I really want a Sabbath, and God's wired me where I can do that. So I finish Thursday most of the time. Don't look at it again until Sunday, but having it on Google Drive makes it where if I'm at a soccer game on Saturday and something pops in my head and I'm not really thinking about it, but like, oh man, that would have been a great illustration for whatever, I can pull it up on my phone, make a quick little edit, make a change. So yeah, so I have that sermon thing done. And I realize different people do this different way, but I do that Thursday. And then Sunday, I'll mark it up a bit more. I'll usually write a little note to myself at the top, just something to remind me, just the heart of what I'm trying to do. And then I'll go through. It's pretty basic. I actually do this part on my iPad. I find that if you mark up everything,
you've marked up nothing.
Well, yeah, exactly. Right. The point is to try to draw your attention to a couple things if necessary. So I don't really have a lot of that, but just a little bit. Again, it's enough to get it in my head. The other thing that I do as part of that whole process is we do use slides for our sermons quite a bit. Our main points will be on slides, quotes will be on slides, cross references will be on slides. Sometimes there will be a picture or something like that. And even though I'm not typically the one actually designing the slide deck, I am picking what's going to be on the slides and communicating that to the folks that are designing it. And so again, that's another way to internalize it and to be thinking about, okay, how's this going to feel? Which are the points where it's going to go directly from this slide to this slide? And which are the ones where it's going to be this slide and then a blank one, because I'm going to be talking about something else for a while. And then another, so thinking that whole process through is part of the internalizing it for me. And then, I print those notes out and I get up with them and preach it. Maybe a quarter of the time during worship, something will pop in my head and I'll jot something down. Or, especially after the first service, I always go to one or more of our other pastors and I just say, hey, what do you got for me? And they know what that means. Is there anything small I should tweak before the next service? It's not a moment to overhaul the thing, right? Like, you got anything for me is not the time to go, well, actually, I hated your outline. Like, well, too late, but so that'll be a time where I might jot a few more notes down. But yeah, I don't mark it up a lot. But again, the whole point of the notes themselves, the whole point of marking up the notes is to internalize it and make it where you can speak it in a way that you're not searching for your words. You're not tied to your notes. You're not having to disconnect from the people in order to get through the sermon.
I think it's important as you're going through that to note as you're preparing, no pun intended, to note as you're preparing, are you connecting with a particular way you're phrasing something? If it's continuing to stumble out of your mouth or you're not quite sold on it, I've found that for me, finding the specific way that I want to say something and really feeling proud of, yeah, that's exactly how I want to say it, that makes it easier for me to come back to that statement and let it just kind of create some momentum and some inertia with other items, as opposed to going up there, not necessarily being sold on exactly the wording. The concept is there. The idea is there. But I think I've said this in a previous episode. I actually plan what I want to say before I call a store or before I call my cell phone company. I plan what I want to say because I don't want to get on the phone and start stumbling around. You called me, right? Like, I'm calling
Spit it
them,
out, man.
spit it out. So I like to have exactly the words that I want to say. Number one, because I want to be understood. But in this concept, and I think, what makes the mastering of the material more important in this concept is today I'm doing marketing videos. I'm doing, website videos. You are communicating God's word. And so there is an element of responsibility, and you got to get it right. It doesn't mean you have to have it, exactly everything.
Sure.
But you got to get it right.
Yeah. And one other thing maybe we should talk about as it relates to marking is colors.
Yeah.
And this, again, gets specific, not prescriptive, but I use a really simple system where any reference to scripture, I put in red. Any illustration, I put in blue. Any quote, I put in green. And the most helpful one for that for me is the blue. And so part of what even doing that does is it helps me look at my notes and go, is this structured the right way?
Yeah.
Do I have illustrations? Like one of the things that I believe is there actually is a sermon architecture in almost every good sermon, has for basically every point, whether it's a 1-point sermon or a 3-point sermon or a 7-point sermon. The best ones have all the same ingredients, different order sometimes, but there's always a statement of whatever the idea is. There's an explanation of what the idea is. There's an argument for why that's true. There's an illustration that brings it to life, and there's a way to apply it. The best sermons, they all have that. Again, it's not always that order. And we actually have a whole tool that helps people explain this on the sermon architecture tool, and would encourage people to check that out. It's totally free. But yeah, having notes follow that structure is actually a good way of me making sure I don't leave one of those things out, and being able to see it at a glance and go, okay, and again, I don't generally go statement, explanation, but I'm able to look through it and go, you know what, there's not enough proving. There's enough arguing here. Like this is a little light, so being able to visually look at your notes and figure that out, it's really helpful.
The phrase you use there is at a glance. For me, that's the sweet spot. When I can look at something at a glance and immediately it sets me in the direction that I need to go. I was listening to a media personality years and years ago, was asked to present somewhere, and they said, how long does it take for you to prepare your speech? He says, speech? I don't prepare a speech. He says, I write down things that are inside of my heart. It's not preaching a sermon, but he's like, I write down the things that are in my heart, and I know the audience, and there's probably 3 or 4 things that I want to say, but it's who I am. It's what's inside of me. It is at the core what I believe, at my very, very core. So he says, I will write it down either on a Post-it note, or I'll just jot it down on my hand, and it'll be, point 1, point 2, point 3, and then I'll just riff. And, typically where he was invited to speak, you could talk as long as you wanted to.
Yeah. Well, and if he's getting to talk about all his hot button, sugar stick issues, that's awesome. Like hand him a copy of Isaiah 57 and go do something with this, man. And that's where it is. Like, you got to do some work I mean, if you're going to preach Romans 8:28, maybe you need notes, but if you're going to preach Isaiah 57, you either do need notes, or you got to do some real work to internalize it. And that, again, that's the point. You're trying to connect with people, bring God's word to bear.
What I like about the sermon architecture, and then we'll go into preaching, is especially in the earlier years, just using that almost as a checklist of like, hey, do I have the elements in here that I need? And then marking it up from there. I think that's just a great service. Like, build the practice so you can do it. That way, when you need it, you've got it, internalized as a system. Now you've got the preaching. We started the episode like, should we try and get away from preaching sermon notes? And in my earlier years, my 20s, it seemed like that was the holy grail. It was like, man, if I could just get up there and preach without notes. And so falsely, I thought like, man, if I get up there and preach with notes, they're going to look at me and they're going to think like he doesn't know his material. And it's like, well, I don't want to look like an idiot. So I'm going to get up there with notes because I don't have this all memorized. You get up and you're preaching with your notes. What are some of the things that maybe you've seen other guys do, and maybe some of the distractions or whatnot?
This is where we start to get really some practical suggestions.
Yeah.
So there was a guy that went through our recent preaching lab, and part of what I do in that preaching lab is I watch a couple of sermons and give guys real feedback. They don't normally get that. You get a, hey, great job, Pastor.
Good job.
From
great sermon.
But to have someone really go, hey, here's what was awesome. Do more of this. Here's what, you could work on. One of the things I noticed for him is he preached from like a kind of a tabletop, high table thing, but he set it way off to the side. And the reason is he wanted to feel like physically free. He didn't want a barrier. The problem was it was too far off to the side. And every time he needed to go back to his notes, he had to like totally disengage from the people. So he put it over there so he could be more engaged with the people, but it actually was disengaging him because of where he put it. So sometimes it's like, just figure out where you're going to put it. I think especially for someone that is going to be doing a manuscript, having more of a sloped pulpit or a sloped music stand rather than a flat table, because on that kind of a thing, you can actually be still looking out over your notes while you're reading it and making a little bit better eye contact. You don't have to look quite as far down. So I think that's a key thing. How tall are you? I know there's some pastors that this guy's 6'4", and you probably need something a little taller so that you don't have to look so far down. And so I think about that. There's the body language and movement piece. One of the things that is really weird is sometimes it looks like someone's got like there's a bungee cord attached to the pulpit or the table or whatever, and attached to their belt. And it's like they'll walk to the right and then boing, come back to the notes, and then walk to the left, boing, and come back to the notes. The best movement, if you're a mover, right? If you're not just going to stay behind the pulpit, which either way, again, I don't care, just connect with people. But the best is to move, stay there for a while, and then move again intentionally, stay there for a while, not just yo-yoing back and forth. But again, if you're more dependent on your notes, you really can't do that, And so in that case, I would say it's better to just mostly stay stationary and occasionally move, rather than having that yo-yo effect of going back and forth. So there's other kind of I don't know. This is really in the weeds. But I mentioned we have slides.
Mm-hmm.
We have on the back, we project them on the back like a confidence monitor. A lot of churches will have that with a clock and with different stuff. I actually intentionally, when I'm reading from the screen, I read from the screen up front. I don't look at the back. And the reason is I'm trying not to draw attention to the back.
Yeah.
Because I don't want people looking back there, what's he going to say? Oh, wow. How long is he going? And so, so that's again, a little detail thing. I'd rather draw their attention to what they're going to look at. I'm going to look at the same thing. So yeah, those are a couple ideas.
So the conversation point is really less about what your notes should look like and what your notes do look like, and more along the lines of, are your notes actually aiding you, not just in the delivery of the material, but also the additional elements of communication? And that type of feedback, we're buddies, but I really don't provide you any type of feedback on your sermons other than I'll send you a text message. Hey, you did a really great job today, or that was really solid. And I think I gave a little bit more specific feedback on this last one. Because we've spent so much time together.
Yeah, it's fun. As we talk about stuff, you're paying attention to more things. So.
Well, I see exactly what you're doing. And so in the sermon architecture tool, you talk about the argument, and you need to argue the material. And it's, a debate, a speech and debate truth is you have to know your opponent's position as well as your own before you can ever defend your own position. Right. And so being able to make that argument and set up somebody else's position that they might not believe what you believe, but that's pretty much how I feel about it. And then you can make your point.
Yeah. So you heard me do that, and you sent me a text and hey, that was cool how you did that.
That's exactly right. But I don't really want to give you mechanical feedback on your sermon, partially because I don't preach.
Yeah.
And then the other part is I know you've got other people in your life who do that, whereas most pastors don't necessarily have those people in their life who give them mechanical feedback, right?
Yeah. Well, and we did a thing this past summer at our church at Redemption Gateway where we had a training day. So as we just said, we have three services. We had a different guy developing.
I think this is a great concept.
Preach his first ever sermon on a Sunday, one at each service. Well, one of the guys, it was it was so cute. He said, "How do you get your notes to not blow around in the air conditioning?" We're in Arizona. It's the summer. There's a lot of air conditioning.
The air is going.
But he's going, I want to be able to see them. So if I have something on top of it, I'm not going to be able to see it. But if I don't have something on top of it, it's going to blow away. And I said, well, let me show you how I lay my Bible a little. And it's and you go oh, that's so silly. But guys, that's what we're doing.
Right.
We're all just bumbling our way through this, trying to figure out. Yeah. That's my hope with this conversation is it's like not trying to go, here's the way to do it, but to go, here's some things to think about. And I think it is these little details that make a difference in your level of confidence. They make a difference in your level of engagement with people. So I think it's worth paying attention to.
In the marketing conversation, there's just a lot happening in order to really make a good connection with an audience. Maybe some of these terms will sound familiar, but like search engine optimization and social media and video and live streaming and website and all sorts of different terminology. And folks will say, well, which one's the most important? And I was like, not necessarily like there's one most important, but I can tell you if you get all of them right, but one, that one isn't going to break it. But if you get multiple ones of them wrong, like you're really not going to get the benefit of the one that you're doing really well. It's kind of this, you need to pay attention to all of it. And I feel like that might be what we're saying here is like, look, how you structure your notes, that's not going to make or break the sermon. But how you structure your notes and how much you've rehearsed and how much preparing you've done and what books you've read and all of these things together, that's what ultimately will make the difference, not necessarily in that message, but in your ability to communicate the message week in and week out. It's not a one silver bullet. It's a yes and all of the above.
Yeah. When I'm just always looking for every advantage to feel more comfortable.
Yeah, that's good.
Like I just go, this is everyone's greatest fear anyway, is public speaking.
Yeah.
If there's anything I can do to make it feel like a home game, if there's anything I can do to feel 1% more confident, I'm going to do it. And so that's where I go, like, if you're like, my notes, well, then try something else. Like figure out something to just set yourself at ease. Don't overthink it. They're there to serve you. I don't know. I mean, if there's someone out there going, well, no notes is better. Okay. Who cares? Like you're answering to the Lord. The Lord isn't saying it. So, do whatever it takes to be as engaging as you can be and faithful as you can be. And getting a little comfortable, man. That makes a big difference.
How are you reusing your notes or archiving your notes these days and getting the most out of them? Because you just gave like 8, 10, 12, 16 collective hours over the course of time into content that went into this sermon. What does that archiving process look like for you these days?
Yeah, so my study material, I do all that in Evernote. And we had a bonus episode where I talked through my whole process of developing a sermon. So you can hear more about that. So I can go back at any point in Evernote and figure out, the different commentary notes I took and stuff like that. And then the actual sermon notes, again, I do that on Google Drive. I just organize it by redemption sermons, by the year, by the series, and then have them in there. We did a series earlier this year on Romans 8, and I preached Romans 8, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years ago, something like that, as part of a whole series on Romans. And it was great to be able to go back. And some of it you go back and you're like, what is this? Like, this, I don't know what this was, but this seems like a terrible sermon. And some of it you go, oh yeah, I remember this one. It was pretty good. And then, some of it you go, oh, I remember that illustration. You know what? I'm going to reuse that illustration, or so being able to go back in it is helpful. And actually, even in that case, it was nice to be able to go back and watch it. Right. We had sermon video from that, and I could go back because even I was looking at the notes going, what does that mean? Well, I went back and watched. Oh, that's what that meant. So yeah, being able to archive that, I think is helpful.
One of the things that I really like about the videos and getting transcriptions and even sermon notes and things like that is with AI. Now, AI should not be preaching your messages for you, but AI is a great tool for taking what you've already got or a framework of what you're doing or looking for an alternate way to say something. Like one way that I would use it today, I've mentioned this multiple times. I did not like saying the same word over and over and over. I always wanted synonyms. So now you could just pop into AI. I used to use Google or a thesaurus. Now you can just pop into AI. What are 5 different ways to say this? And it'll give me 5 different ways. And that's just really, really helpful when either I don't want to say the same thing twice, I want to come at it from a different angle, or I'm not confident that I'm getting the core point across that I really want to. Well, you can take these old transcripts and you can just pop it into AI and you just say, hey, what were some of the best points from this? Or what are the main points from this last sermon? And see what it comes out with. And that could be a way of kind of spurring some ideas on how you could reuse that material.
Yeah, for sure.
So any final thoughts about sermon notes, the archive process? I know physically you just walk out, and what do you do after a message? that
Yeah,
you preach?
this is part of my ritual. At the end of the day, I go back, after I've preached and the service is over and I've greeted new people and prayed with folks who might want it, and I'm done. Whenever I'm done, I head back to the office and I pull my notes out of my Bible and I pray. And I'm actually getting a little emotional talking about it because it's like just meaningful to me that like I get them out and I say, Lord, thank you so much. This was a delight, or this was a tough one today, or,
Yeah.
whatever it is. And I'm just going to trust that somehow you're going to use this. And then I put the notes in the trash. And it is this symbolic way of going like, I'm not my sermon. This is not what I live for. And, by the way, next Sunday's coming. So this is over. Like, and I do, go back and you review and you watch things and you get feedback afterward. It is a way of just taking my offering to the Lord, putting it on the altar and going, all right, Lord, here it is. So yeah, that's a fun little ritual to end the day.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Again, much of this episode, if not all of it, is descriptive. Don't feel like you have to do any of these things, but if one of them is helpful, if it helps you improve by 1%, geez, why would you not want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to take advantage? Try some out. If it works for you, great. If you have to modify a little bit, great. The truth is that God is going to use you in a unique way. He's wired you unlike anybody else. Yeah, there might be some similarities. So take the similarities from what you've seen, use it to your advantage, but really allow God to work in you and through you, and be confident enough to say, you know what? I'm just better when I've got bullet point notes, and be comfortable with that. You know what? I really am confident right now reading from a manuscript, but I want to get better in this area. Well, then challenge yourself to get better and see if you can surround yourself with some voices of people who can do that. We would love to be able to do that. Matter of fact, that's why we do this podcast. And if there's any more insight that maybe we can provide about this topic and answer some questions, or if you want to see how Luke positions his notes in his Bible on the stand so they don't blow away in the air condition, info@faithfulandfruitful.com. We would just love to hear from you and hear how God is using you and what he's doing in your ministry. If you're listening on Apple Music or Apple Podcast or Spotify, please take a moment and leave a review. That's really the only thing that we would love to ask of you. Other than that, we'd just love for this to serve you and just give to you. But if you could return that favor, that would be great. Luke, we've got more episodes coming up. I think we're about halfway through now, just a little bit over halfway through season 2. I can't believe that. Oh my gosh. We're almost to that 8 podcast episode mark, which is where most podcasts die.
Sweet.
So we're almost there for season 2.
Let's finish strong.
We will finish strong. Thanks for listening. God bless. Take care. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.